So I do want to talk a little bit about the end-fed half-wave antenna. This antenna seems to have taken over the ham radio universe, both in videos, in articles. When we're talking about antennas, there's always a new antenna, and there's always a better antenna out there. But I've never seen an antenna rise to prominence so quickly as the end-fed half-wave. I think the GRV possibly might be in the same category, and maybe the off-center fed dipole, the Wyndham, gained a lot of popularity, but nothing like this end-fed half-wave phenomena that we're seeing in the ham radio community. It's absolutely astounding how much is out there and how many people want to use the end-fed half-wave. You might remember I did a video several years ago called Antenna Psychology. Antenna Psychology, okay? This is a video that you probably need to watch to get the full understanding of what I'm talking about. What's the one thing about ham radio that almost everyone can have a comment on, almost everybody can have an opinion about, almost everybody can work with, maybe even create? The antenna. You might not be able to build a radio. You might not be able to even figure out how the radio works, but you certainly can put a wire in the air. You can cut a wire to a certain length in meters and come up with an antenna that works. That's the great thing about antennas. Antennas is really the common denominator that gets all of us hams in the same bucket. Now, we're not completely in the same bucket. In that video, Antenna Psychology, you might remember I had divided hams into 4 quadrants. We had the kind of the newcomer ham, the casual operator ham. We had the experimenter ham. He's the guy that's always playing with new types of antennas. We had the formula ham. Okay, the formula ham, he's the guy that just wants to get something that he knows is going to work with no fuss. And then finally, the antenna expert, the PhD of antennas, the guy that's going to be at the forefront of building the best antenna system on the planet. Money's no object. Location is no object. He's going to be in the best spot on the highest hill with the most towers. So those 4 types of hams. So I do suggest that you watch this video first, at least the first third of it, where we go through the types of ham antenna personalities, and then maybe you'll understand a little bit more where the end-fed half-wave belongs in those 4 quadrants. So let's talk about it a little more. Now, this is a half-wave antenna. A half-wave antenna, as you know, is kind of a bipolar affair. On one side you have the phase going up, and on the other side you have the phase going down. And when we feed it in the middle, we get an efficient waveform that's transmitted. And we know that because of the physics of the universe, the universe being 377 ohms of impedance, that a half-wave dipole is roughly a 75 ohm type antenna in free space. And when we bring it closer to the Earth, we get something like a 50 ohms or, a pretty good match to 50 ohm coax. And you know that most hams just want an antenna that's efficient, allows you to make contacts, and most importantly, that it has a low SWR. So we all would like to have a low SWR. After all, we don't want to burn up our transmitter or our transceiver. And we would like to know that we have a well-matched antenna. The problem is, we all have these SWR bridges. It's the first thing we get as a ham, probably. You might even have an SWR meter given to you before you get your ham radio. These are passed down traditionally from the Elmer to the beginning ham, and some of them are voltage instruments and some of them are power instruments, but they all do the same thing. They tell you how well matched you are to your antenna, or do they? They're really just reporting how well matched you are to the end of the coax. That end of the coax could be right in front of you with your radio. In fact, most radios have the SWR function built into them now. So it's very convenient just to go to the power setting on your transmitter and the SWR setting on your transceiver, and bingo, you know what your SWR is to the antenna. One way to use an SWR bridge effectively with your station is to, and let's say we're talking about a beam or a dipole antenna, it's to simply measure the SWR between 2 points on the band. Now, maybe the 3-to-1 points are a good place to start. So if we measure down as low as we can go on the band to as high as we can go on the band and stay below 3-to-1, we look at that bandwidth. Now, most hams think the wider that is, in other words, the entire band, the better the antenna is, or the more effective the antenna is, or maybe the more useful the antenna is because I don't need to fuss with it. It's matched across the whole band. That's a positive thing. But I'm going to burst that bubble a little bit because that generally means that you've got a resistor somewhere in the system. And by a resistor, I mean some type of loss. Power is going somewhere, and it's not being radiated. It's going someplace in the system, and it's being dissipated. It's being used up. It's being wasted. I know a good place that power can be wasted. How about the core of your end-fed half-wave antenna? That's a wonderful place to introduce some resistance that might make our SWR look better, but it's power that's not going out over the air. So let's talk a little bit about that transformer itself. But before we get there, let's talk about the way we feed power into that transformer, or into that dipole, or into that beam. It's called a transmission line. This is the thing that connects your transmitter to the antenna. Now, ideally, that transmission line does not radiate. It's not part of the antenna system. But when we switched from open wire balanced feed line, and then on the feed line down and up opposite directions, a totally balanced antenna, we didn't have any feed line radiation. All of the radiation was coming out the antenna, and you were coupling effectively to the universe with your antenna. Yes, the antenna is a coupler. It's a coupler to the impedance of the universe as you radiate. So you don't want the transmission line to radiate, you want the antenna to radiate. A perfectly balanced system. Somewhere along the line, maybe it's the 40s, the 50s, or 60s, somebody came up with this Coax idea, where we attached Coax to that dipole. Now, once you attach Coax to the dipole, you don't just have I1 and I2, I1 and I2, you have I3. Did you know that Coax is actually a 3-conductor transmission line? I'm going to say that again. Coaxial cable is a 3-conductor transmission line. You have the center conductor, you have the inside of the shield, and you have the outside of the shield. We'll call that I3. Now, if you don't know what's going on with I3, it can influence I1 and I2, and suddenly the transmission line becomes your antenna. In other words, your wonderful dipole is radiating beautifully, but it's not the dipole that's radiating, it's your feed line. You've made a beautiful vertical antenna, and it's radiating like a vertical because of the mismatch in the balance between I1, I2, and I3. So what do we want to do to the I3? That outside of the coax current that we're not accounting for. We would like to choke it. By choke it, we're going to put an impedance that's so high against it that it no longer has a path. If it doesn't have a path, it cannot radiate. So we like to use a 1-to-1 current transformer at the feed of the dipole. This can be coax wrapped around a big tube. It could be a ferrite transformer, a transmission line transformer. It could be any number of different techniques, a sleeve transformer, and so on. But by getting rid of I3, we now have made the coax look balanced to the antenna. There's no more feed line radiation, and all of the energy is being radiated by the dipole. Now, we still might have mismatch losses. We still might have losses associated with the ends of the antenna, our insulators. We might have losses in proximity to ground. These are all losses you might still have, but at least you know where the current is going in your antenna. In the old days, Grandpa used to put light bulbs and things in his line, and he knew where his current was on the line. Typically, you put 2 flashlight bulbs in the balanced feeders. If one is brighter than the other, you have a mismatch. You're not balanced. So the 2 lights, when they were illuminated the same way, I1 and I2 canceled out perfectly, and all the radiation occurred at the dipole. So now let's talk about the end-fed half wave. The end-fed half wave, where's the ground? Where are the currents? You don't know where the ground is, and you don't know where the currents are. Therefore, you don't know how the end-fed half wave is actually radiating. Is your feed line actually the antenna, and the end-fed half wave just a top hat? It might be. So I know this is going to be a little upsetting to some people, but unless you know where the currents are in your antenna, you do not know if it's actually radiating the way that the model says it's supposed to be radiating. So next, let's look at the transformer itself. Now, there's 2 different styles of transformers that we're interested in with RF. One is called conventional. A conventional transformer has a primary and a secondary, or it's a center-tapped coil. That's a conventional transformer. It uses the core as part of the transformer, and the losses of that core are extremely important as to the efficiency of that conventional transformer. A transmission line transformer, and I go back to Jerry Sevick, W2FMI, transmission line transformer, the core becomes less important. In fact, nothing is going to heat the core in a well-designed transmission line transformer. There's no current flowing in the core. The core is ice cold. It only heats up if you have made a mistake in winding your transformer or have some other losses associated with the balance of the windings. So we have 2 styles of transformers. We have the conventional style, which is inefficient, and you're always working to improve efficiency by controlling the current in the core, sometimes with gaps, sometimes with other techniques. And then you have the transmission line transformer, much more efficient over a wider bandwidth, less determined by the core. You could probably wind it on a jelly donut and get better performance than with a traditional end-fed half-wave transformer. But we have a little problem. It's difficult to make a 49-to-1 or a 64-to-1 transformer in the transmission line style. Pretty easy to do a 4-to-1, a 9-to-1, or even a 16-to-1. But getting up to a 49-to-1 with traditional transmission line transformer theory is very difficult. So I want you to think about that. I want you to think about why when you put 2 end-fed half-wave cores together that you're seeing loss. You're seeing loss because those are not good transformers. Those are not transmission line transformers. They are conventional transformers, and they're going to have a lot of loss associated with them. So let's try to dispel some of the mythology with the end-fed half-wave. It's a compromise. It's definitely giving you broadband performance over several bands. Most of these bands, of course, related to a half wavelength, full wavelength, 2 full wavelengths, and so on. So let's dispel the rumor of the SWR having anything to do with the radiation and the efficiency of your antenna. We know a dipole works. Now, if that antenna is too long or that antenna is too short, we can get to a 2-to-1 SWR if the impedance goes down to 25 ohms or if it goes up to 100 ohms. Pretty straightforward. It's a dipole. Now let's go to the end-fed half-wave. Now the end-fed half-wave is nothing new. The end-fed antenna of the 1920s was one of the very first antennas that was used, especially in lighter-than-air craft. So it was an antenna that you could use with no ground. Okay, that's a benefit. You don't need a ground. Of course, with a dipole, you don't need a ground as well. A coaxial fed dipole or a ladder line fed dipole does not require a ground. Neither does an end-fed half wave. Okay, so this is typically outfitted with some type of counterpoise that acted as an artificial ground for the end-fed half wave. But because it's such a high impedance antenna, the ground becomes less important to the operation of the antenna. So why would we be interested in reviving an antenna that really went out of favor by the 1940s and 1950s? Nobody was using end-fed half waves. It had a slight resurgence once we had those tuners with the roller inductors. They became popular again in the 1970s and 80s because it was an all-band antenna. With the roller inductor, you could tune it, and so on. But now we have this end-fed half wave as our probably go-to primary antenna. Where did that come from? So if you go to the ends of a dipole antenna, the ends of a half wave antenna, we know we have a very high impedance. What is that number? Well, just like the number varies for the dipole, depending on how close it is to the earth. Is it coming right out of your transmitter, dribbling up a lawn chair, going up to the top of your easy up, and going out 50 feet? Or is it being fed by coax up 100 feet, and then it goes off 1 to 49 or 1 to 64 or 1 to, and out a half wavelength from a high situation? Well, we don't know. So the impedance at the end of that wire could vary pretty wildly. That means it's just as easy to get a mismatch at the end of a half wave wire as it is in the middle of the wire with a dipole. So that's the first thing we have to understand. We don't have a perfect match to the end of that wire. There's no free lunch with the end-fed half wave. It also has problems with SWR depending on how it's deployed. Now, we get into the way that you get up to the high frequency. Is that done with a narrowband matching network, such as a tuner, okay? Or is it being done with a broadband matching network, such as an UNUN, basically an auto transformer, or a conventional transformer with a primary that's very low impedance for the coax and a secondary that's very high impedance for the wire? How are you matching to that wire? And how efficient is the transformer that you're using to go from, say, 50 ohms up to 2,500 ohms, or up to 4,000 ohms, or whatever that transformer ratio is? Finding out that there are inefficiencies involved with the transformer, depending on the material of the transformer, what the shape of the toroid inductor is. Now, the ideal is to be able to operate the half wave on all of its harmonics and have that transformer provide a good match and an efficient transmission through all of those bands with no tuner. That makes it pretty nice for these guys that are going out and doing parks on the air or summits on the air, where you just want to connect maybe 20 feet of coax, 10 feet of coax to the rig, put up a bamboo pole or a push-up rod on one side, and then at the far end have another push-up rod or a tree branch, and that represents your antenna. You don't have to worry about tuning. You can operate on 40 meters, 20 meters, 15, 10, so on. So that makes it very desirable. What is the penalty? There's got to be a penalty. You can't get something for nothing. What we find is that an ordinary dipole with even pretty pitiful wire and terrible coax, maybe it's some RG58 left over from, your CB days, and you're just connecting it to 2 pieces of wire that are 33 feet long, and you string this up in the trees. That would be more efficient than one of the best end-fed half waves you could ever come up with. So I've got a very casual dipole going against a tremendously designed end-fed half wave antenna. It's using the best coax. It's using the lowest loss material for the transformer, and it has the wire cut nicely. The dipole still wins. The dipole wins because it has to win. It has no lossy material. It has no impedance mismatch. Both are features of the end-fed half-wave. Wow, that was controversial. It really is hard to prove that a dipole will beat an end-fed half-wave, at least on its fundamental frequency in the real world. But loss is loss, guys. On the higher bands, that's why we use trap dipoles, fan dipoles, things like that on dipoles. Not a bad idea to think about traps on an end-fed half-wave, by the way. We operate a single antenna on multiple bands. It's convenient. All half-wave antennas, including the end-fed half-wave and dipoles, are operated on harmonics at times. But we have patterns that become very messy, basically multi-lobe and sometimes very high angle patterns when we're operating on those harmonics, or overtone modes as they're called. That's why we like the traps and we like the fan dipoles. Operating the end-fed half-wave as a vertical, or as vertical as possible, and elevating the counterpoise or several radials above your head is really going to help your performance as well. The other issue is feed line radiation and high voltage RF near your rig. But don't knock it too much. Common mode feed line radiation may actually be your antenna's best radiating element, and the reason you're really making some of those DX contacts. Again, I haven't dwelled on SWR. SWR is still the easiest way to measure your antenna and how happy your radio is. But unfortunately, it's the least accurate way to tell how effective your antenna operates. What category does the end-fed half-wave fit into with the amateur operator? Does it fit into the expert area? Does it fit into the casual area? Does it fit into the experimenter area? Or does it fit into the formula area? So that's what I'd like you guys to think about. And give me some comments as to where you think the end-fed half-wave belongs. What category of antenna? And what category of ham operator would use an end-fed half-wave?